the fantasy is that you could stop people coming to the UK. You can't stop people coming to the UK. There'll always be new wars. There'll always be refugees. It's a perennial issue, and you can't just like fantasize it away. Poof, like there's one policy that'll do it.
The following is a conversation with Dr. Lucy Mayblin. She is a political sociologist and co-director of the Migration Research Group at the University of Sheffield. Her research focuses on borders, human rights, policy making, and the legacies of colonialism. With immigration playing a key role at the general election, we discuss the politics of asylum seeking and the British government's response to small boat channel crossings. To support our channel, please like and subscribe and check out our sponsors in the description. And now, this is us getting a second opinion from Dr. Lucy Mayblin. Hello, Lucy. It's very nice to have you today. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I know I'm a medic by background, and most of our podcasts have been medics and politicians, but I was interested to have this conversation because I'm a trustee at City of Sanctuary Sheffield, and you're a trustee at Assist, and I was just very interested. I've been reading a lot about refugees and asylum seekers and the politics of migration. I thought it'd be very nice to have you on this podcast today. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and what actually got you interested in this field?
Yeah, in channel crossings.
Yeah, in channel crossings.
So I'm a political sociologist. I work on the politics of asylum and borders. And this project that I've been doing about channel crossings is it's been quite a lot of years in the making. So perhaps around 2017, so a lot of my work is about the history of empire and how the history of British colonialism has shaped the politics of borders and asylum. And at that time, there weren't very many people who worked on that at all. So I worked really closely with somebody called Joe Turner, and we had read a paper that we loved about Calais and the situation in Calais, but thinking of that, I think it's called Ruins of Empire, thinking of that through empire by Tom Davis and Arshad Izakji. And so we just emailed them and said, hey, like, you're doing this work and it's really exciting, and we're doing similar work, so would you be interested to talk? And so we started talking about that, and we did a different grant application about the different flows of people over the channel. At that time, people seeking asylum were bottlenecked and stuck in Calais, but they wouldn't be crossing in small boats. They'd be stowing away in lorries. Yes. But also other kinds of movement across the channel is highly facilitated and must not stop 365 days a year. So we were just having conversations about how we were interested in this border as a filter, and some people's movement, some types of movement, especially in the aftermath of Brexit, must not be stopped. We're very worried about being stopped or disturbed. Lorry parks in Kent with lorries being stopped because of Brexit checks and things. And then other people, their movement across the channel being a huge problem, that any amount of money, any means must be done to stop them from moving. So we were just having conversations about that, and did one grant application about that, which was not successful. But in the meantime, people had switched from crossing in lorries to crossing in small boats. Around 2018 that began. And that had been a small part of the project. And so we thought that would be an interesting part to expand, because small boats are more visible than stowing away in lorries. So it became it's not more people crossing, but it's a different mode. And so it became this really spectacular political controversy with journalists following boats with microphones and all kinds of crazy things. So then we proposed a project to a funder to look at the kind of politics of this border, and how politicians and policymakers talk about it, how the policies over decades and decades have produced small boat channel crossings, how people experience those crossings themselves, how NGOs and activists challenge or contest it if they can, just exploring all the dimensions of it. So that's how we came to do that work.
I will be asking a lot of questions about the channel crossings, and we'll build to that. So let's start off with refugees and asylum seekers. Could you describe, from your understanding, being in this field for a long time, could you describe your understanding or outlining the journey of a refugee or asylum seeker coming from their home country to the UK or Europe? That's a very big question, and I have follow-ons from there. But
yeah, so I guess one thing to say at the start of that is that the phenomenon of forced migration isn't like one thing. So it's complex because you've got people from a massive range of countries. They are diverse by language, religion, region of the world, ethnic background, anything that we can think of. And then it's not only complex, but it's dynamic. So it's complex at this moment in time, but in 2 years' time, the makeup of that complex group of people will be different because there'll be different global conflicts and things. So it's really hard to kind of say one clear thing about like who are those people and where do they come from, sort of thing. It's complex today and it's dynamic, and it changes all the time. But people who make an application for asylum in a host country are people who have been persecuted in their home country in some way. It's not possible now to travel from a region of origin where you have been persecuted, let's say Iran, to the UK, because border controls are very diffuse and all across the whole journey. It's not just when you arrive in the UK that you get to the UK border. And airlines are responsible, all kinds of carriers, including airlines, are responsible for checking that people have the right to arrive in the country that they're going to arrive in, and they'll be fined if they let anyone. So if somebody says, I'd like to come to the UK because I want to apply for asylum, they won't be allowed to board. They have to present themselves to apply for asylum only when they're on the territory. So because people can't travel through those normal ways that we would think that they might use, then they have to travel what we would call irregularly, not through regular means. And so that'll just really vary depending on where they've come from in the world, and where that is in relation to where they want to get to. They'll use friends and family and different networks. Some of those people in those networks will be called smugglers or be involved in things that are, smuggling sometimes, but sometimes that will be paid and sometimes it will not be paid. Sometimes it will be organized, part of an organized smuggling organization, but operation. And sometimes it will be relatively ad hoc. So it's all kind of different means that people would travel irregularly. And as you hit different borders, you encounter different challenges. Particularly if we're thinking about channel crossings, getting to France, you hit particular challenges traversing that border from France to the UK.
So when you talk about people fleeing persecution, could we expand on that? What is the difference between maybe living in a third world country where there's financial and living challenges to actually at the point that you feel your life is actually at threat? Could you talk about that experience?
So I suppose there's two dimensions to that. The first thing to say is that we know globally there's massive amounts of data analysis and research over decades on the relationship between poverty and economic impoverishment and development and migration. And so what we know is that there is not a correlation between poverty in a country, generalized poverty, and an increase in the number of asylum applications from that country in, say, if we look at the kind of who's applying for asylum in across different European countries at different points in time, it doesn't correlate to the poorest places. So poverty alone is not a dynamic. So when you see countries represented in those statistics, You find systematic human rights violations, wars, civil war, foreign military intervention, or specific persecution. Like human rights violations would include specific persecutions of like particular ethnic groups or particular religious groups or this kind of thing. So that's one thing to say, like a big kind of misconception that people apply for asylum because they're from a poor country. What you actually find with poverty is that people migrate to urban areas and they might migrate within their region for work. And then what do we mean by persecution? So that can mean a lot of different things, but when we define something legally, we kind of put boundaries around it, and that might be different to the full expansive way of thinking about that thing.
Sure.
So the right to refugee rights come from the Geneva Convention, which emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War and the persecution of Jewish people and others by the Nazi regime. So those people found that once they'd left being protected as a citizen in Germany, they had no rights. If they were not a citizen of a country, they were rightless in another country. So the Refugee Convention was meant to create a set of rights where if you'd been persecuted in a country, when you left, you still had some rights. You weren't just abandoned. So within the Geneva Convention, based on that model of the mid-20th century refugee, then persecution, it was initially only Europeans. Now it's been expanded. It was expanded in 1967. But the definition of persecution that we would use in the UK is individual based. So you apply as an individual and you have to be able to prove that you individually as a person have been targeted. So you might be a dissident or a journalist, and there might be like a death warrant or a newspaper article about you or something like specific to you where you can prove that there's a threat to your life or an experience where you've been able to document that. Other parts of the world have different, more expansive definitions. So the African Union Convention on Refugees, they allow for group rights. So like if you're part of a group, a larger group, you can automatically...
Like an ethnic group or racial group? Okay. Yeah. That's been targeted.
In the Refugee Convention, they do have this vague concept of a particular social group. So sometimes people can use that in the UK to say that they've been persecuted because they're part of a particular social group. And that could be, for example, because of their sexuality or because, something like that, where but they still need to be able to prove that as an individual because of this. Yeah. So persecution involves anything where the state that you're from is persecuting you. And so sometimes you might be persecuted by a non-state actor, but you have to be, so that sexuality would be included in that often. But you have to be able to prove that the state failed to protect you from non-state actors. So it's actually quite complex. It sounds like persecution wouldn't be obvious, but it's quite complex and it depends where you are.
To prove it and define it.
Yeah. And so if we have this general definition, then over the decades, different systems have been developed to process that, to assess it, to say what evidence do you need to present, who can apply. So there's countries where if you're from that country's on a white list and it doesn't matter what has happened to you, you can't be persecuted. So say the US is on a white list. If you're from the US, you can't be persecuted according to that rule. So
why is that?
So they have white lists to prevent people. So since the early 2000s, so something happened where in this aftermath of the Second World War, people were mainly applying for asylum in Western Europe and North America. But let's stick to Europe because of Cold War politics. So states were generally pretty keen to take Soviet defectors, asylum seekers, and to say, haha, like our system's better. we'll give you asylum, poor you, you're from the Soviet Union. In the late 90s and early 2000s, with the rise of international air travel being cheaper and different kinds of conflicts going on in the world, more people started applying for asylum who were from formerly colonized countries, from the third world, as you said earlier. And so states responded to this by saying those people can't be real refugees because they're black and brown and from poor countries. They have to be economic migrants in disguise. And so they started this process. Successive governments across Western Europe, including the UK, started slowly rolling back on their kind of openness to refugees and asylum seekers. So they did loads of things to narrow how they defined who is a refugee, to create a higher bar for the evidence that you have to present, to decrease appeal rights, to reduce access to lawyers. It's almost impossible to get a legal aid lawyer now. They took people outside of the mainstream welfare system, put them in a parallel system where they live in poverty. They dispersed people around the country so they couldn't all live in London with people that they knew, so dispersed people to lots of different places on a no-choice basis. Did lots of different things to make it really, really, really hard to actually be successful in either getting to the UK, so lots of border control things, and when you were here, made it really hard to be recognised as a refugee. And that's just been basically constant since about 2001, 2002.
I wanted to spend the beginning part of this conversation just to actually understand the journey and also how challenging it is. And you kind of did touch on it. So I guess for the UK then, what is the process for someone then applying for asylum? You did kind of talk about the irregular migration. And
I realised that I didn't talk about people's journeys across Europe to France. Did you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, there's so many different things to say.
To talk about that, that's good.
So why do people, or how do people, what's happening to people in Europe? So most people arrive in, like, obviously on the eastern and southern borders of Europe. And when you enter Europe, you are, if you interface with the authorities, you will be fingerprinted, and your fingerprints will go into the Eurodac database so that people all over Europe, authorities around Europe, can see if you have been in another European country. And this was intended to stop what they call asylum shopping, where people go to a country that they would like to live in rather than the first country. So if you arrive, and you've arrived, let's say, for example, in Italy, and you are fingerprinted, then you are essentially stuck in Italy. You can't apply for asylum in another European country for, I think, 2 years at least. But in Italy and Greece are extremely hostile to new arrivals crossing the Channel. Sorry, not the Channel, the Mediterranean. And so when people arrive there, they are not housed. They might get 2 days in a shelter in Italy. And they also, people report being kind of coerced and encouraged to get on like trains. They're given maps to go to other parts of Europe, like the Italians and the Greeks don't really want them there. There's widespread like street violence, racism in Italy and Greece. So people often find themselves in a situation where they can't go back. They're not going to go back across the Mediterranean to Libya, which is a place where many people find themselves in like situations of extreme violence. Many people are kidnapped for ransom for their family. People are enslaved, find themselves in forced labor. There's organ harvesting. There's just horrific detention centers in the middle of the desert with like well-known human rights violations. It's like a really dystopian place for people. They can't really go back to Libya.
Yeah.
So where do you go? You go forward. So some of the people who are in northern France are people who are what we might call bureaucratically entrapped. So they can't go backwards, but they can't stay where they are. They can't apply for asylum in France because they're in Eurodac. Some people do try and burn their fingerprints off with acid or fire, but some people seek to move on to somewhere else, in this case, the UK. Other people who want to cross are people who specifically wanted to get to the UK because they have family and friends there. And it's always been their intention since they set off from home to reunite with their family in a particular place. And the UK is quite popular because of the language, especially because of the global power of the English language, because of colonial connections. So, for example, in Eritrea, people have their education in English. So in like a lot of places, it's like the one language that people have a tacit knowledge of, and also obviously the hegemony of the US. So that's another reason.
Yeah.
Increasingly, when we've been in Calais, we've been talking to people who, I think this is like a new emerging phenomenon, who've been in other European countries for a number of years, since 2015, 16 often. They've been in a situation, say in Germany, where they find that they are like housed in an unpleasant place, that they having to renew these permits. They can't seem to get on with their life and like get a job, and they just feel that they're stagnating and that they want to move on and try somewhere else. And so some people we met in Calais are trying to move on to the UK to try and see if that is a better place that they could start a life. Yeah. So there's different sorts of reasons
why people are moving.
Yeah, like nothing in this is like a simple answer. There isn't a kind of simple politically palatable answer that's either, oh, they're all tragic victims who have no agency, or they're all evil scoundrels. There's like very, as I started at the beginning, like a complex mix of people with complex lives and motivations, also interfacing with state bureaucracies and borders and different people who are augmenting their journeys and their aspirations.
So, let's say when you arrive at one of the frontier countries like Italy or Greece, how do you go about actually providing evidence to show that you are being persecuted or your life is actually threatened? Because for me, I'm just imagining the challenging circumstances just to get there, to go through other Asian or African countries. How do you so you talked about the fingerprinting, and then what's the next step? Like, how do you actually go about applying?
Yeah, so in the Geneva Convention, it said that people should be able to travel without any travel documents, any passports, anything, because of the situations they'd fled. Why would we expect someone who's a refugee to be able to gather together all the most pertinent documents in that moment of fleeing?
Yes.
But states tend not to recognize that part of the convention now. But at the same time, because it's impossible to, say, travel like that, like get on an aeroplane, when you're traveling irregularly, you're obviously crossing borders without passports because you're doing it in a clandestine way. When you encounter authorities, and if they are processing you and you're entering an asylum system, you will often then suddenly find that you need a whole lot of evidence that you didn't know that you needed. So people often don't have very much understanding of a whole load of things to do with life in the place that they're going, including unless they might imagine that they might apply for asylum, but they would assume that that would go along with working, that people would expect them to work. They might not know it'll be illegal to work. They might not know what the asylum system involves, or why you would need a lawyer to do that, or you'd need all these documents, kind of thing. This could be really difficult, especially in the past, to be proving persecution. I think in the digital age, actually, that can be helpful for people because like on social media and things like that, the digital evidence, you have more evidence of your life is more documented. Whereas if people were persecuting you 40 years ago, there might be no paper trail. It happens only in dark corners and out of sight. Whereas I think with the digital thing, there is the possibility, but you will find also that authorities will purposefully go through people's like social media accounts and things to try and see if what they're saying is true. So you say you're gay, but we can't find you being a member of any Pride Facebook groups or something, you know. So like just going through, so it can play in people's hands or not. But yeah, you need to be able to prove these things, and so it tends to be quite straightforward for people. If they are like a member of an opposition party or a high-profile journalist or something, it can be much faster. Yeah. If they are an Eritrean wanting to flee the like military conscription or something and leave very quickly at night, and this happens to all young men in Eritrea and, you know, all of the things, then it can be, you're talking about a generalized country situation. And so authorities tend to then rely on like country reports by experts and things like that. But it becomes a very long and protracted process of trying to prove this thing, perhaps being rejected, perhaps then assembling some more evidence, perhaps appealing, and then ultimately, but it can take a really, really, really long time. Yes. Yeah. So if you present yourself at a border and you get fingerprinted and you're like, I want to apply for asylum, that's not like then 2 days later someone's decided. You then enter into this many years long process, where you'll probably be in detention, or you'll be in a hotel in Preston, or, you know, just really, really long time waiting to go through that system. And you may or may not have any access to legal advice, to lawyers who understand all of the bureaucracy of that system.
And then you were talking about Italy, Greece, maybe some of these frontier countries that are facing the greatest number of refugees and asylum seekers coming in. You were talking about that actually somewhat-ish, maybe unofficially, they're encouraging these individuals to actually go to other more central European countries. Do you think that's just because of, I don't know, financial challenges that they're facing or waiting list, or is it actually more of a resentment of people coming to their country? I guess, what is that relationship and why is that happening?
I mean, motivations are notoriously difficult to prove. Yes. But I think probably a case of both. Okay. I mean, frontier countries have made many representations to the EU to say that it's this whole thing about asylum shopping and the common European asylum system, wanting to transfer people back, the Dublin system that I think you talked about earlier. So the Dublin system being where if you find someone that they've been through another country, that you can send them back to that country. They've made many representations saying they think that's unfair and that Europe should have burden sharing. And so that's definitely a part of the picture. Also, part of the picture is obviously like racism and hostility. There's a far-right government in Italy. So, and some other border states in the east have quite right-wing governments. There's a high amount of anti-immigrant sentiment and racism across Europe. So I think those different things interact with each other, like many factors.
So then, to further understand what is the EU's policy for dealing with this, I've done a little bit of reading. You've got the Dublin Accord, you've got the Schengen area, which is the combination of countries that, you know, monitor and maybe even transfer or deal with refugees and asylum seekers. I guess, could you maybe summarize that about how does the EU go about managing refugees and asylum seekers, and maybe where do you see the challenges are with it, or where's the bottleneck that we're seeing? Well, there's a very big question I know I've asked, so I'll break that down.
Even though, so the Schengen space is a free movement space, it's not really about managing asylum. It's about being able to freely move in this space and not have any borders. But even though you have that and you have kind of tentative or on paper agreements that there should be a collaboration on these issues, actually European states are extremely reluctant to give up sovereignty over their borders to do when there was the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015-16, only Germany and Sweden said that they would actively partake in burden sharing in a kind of, and took a good number of people. There's a lot of reluctance to do meaningful collaboration on these issues. Where they will collaborate is on anything that is to do with like very strict border control. So Frontex, the European Border Control Agency, is extremely well funded.
Yeah.
The EU Trust Fund for Africa and other kind of massive tranches of development aid, which are like a large proportion of which is allocated to stopping people migrating, like training border forces and introducing like biometric citizen databases and things like that in Africa. They'll put a lot of money into those kinds of schemes, into the border control schemes.
Yeah.
Where it comes to meaningfully burden sharing, or let's say fairly taking their fair share of the people who would like to seek asylum in Europe and processing those. It's highly variable. And the common European asylum system doesn't work in the sense that countries have very different like recognition rates, very different. A person of a certain nationality might have a much higher chance of statistically being recognized in one country than others. So there's a lot of...
Is that partly because you mentioned earlier, if there's a known political war or political injustice or genocide, therefore it may be easier to accept, or actually there's a media appearance that there's a war in Iraq, and then they're asking the politicians, how many refugees are you accepting from Iraq? But then let's say some people who are rightfully asking for refugee asylum from India, because there's no active war maybe known there, they're not accepting it. So do you think that politics also has an impact on maybe those central countries on how many refugees, asylum seekers they would take?
Yeah. So that dynamic of how high profile is a conflict plays in to things, of course, because if it's on the news every day and it's completely undeniable that there's like a huge and violent civil war or foreign invasion or something going on, or say Britain is involved in invading Iraq and it's on the news every day, and then you can't say, oh, nobody from Iraq is really an asylum seeker. So you would be accepting high numbers. Say around 2005, people from Iraq were really highly likely to get asylum in the UK if they'd applied. But then at a point at which you want to represent Iraq as a safe place that's all been sorted out, then suddenly the numbers will go down. The situation for Syrians is like that in the UK at the moment. It's a frozen, freezing, waiting to see, basically saying we won't assess any more of these claims because people can go home. And so those things play into it about those nationalities, but also how right-wing, how anti-immigration, what the kind of politics around that is in a country also shapes not just between nationalities, but between countries for the same nationality. You can have very different. So even though it's meant to be an international refugee system with clear criteria, in one country, it might be much more likely that you would be recognized with the same evidence than in another country. So France, for example, has very low recognition rates for lots of nationalities, that in the UK, there would be a high chance of somebody being recognized as a refugee.
Overall, would you say that does the EU policy for dealing with refugees and asylum seekers actually work? We're seeing an increase in the number of people coming from Africa and Asia. And then we've already talked about the challenges of frontier countries versus central countries, and voluntary taking in refugees versus maybe even mandatory, some countries taking in refugees. I know part of your work we were talking about just before is, are we asking the right questions? Are we thinking about this in the right way? Could you maybe even give me some insights on what is maybe a better way to actually assess or deal with this?
Yeah, so I suppose on the theme of different questions.
Yes.
One thing is, this is an interesting question. Are there more people? Are there more refugees now? And if you look at the proportion of refugees in the world compared to the world population, over time, since the middle of the 20th century, there has not been a dramatic increase in the number of refugees proportionate to the world population. And the number of refugees ebbs and flows with massive conflict. Like if you look at a graph, you see, oh, there's Ukraine. Oh, there's the Iraq war. You kind of see these ebbs and flows of different numbers. I think it's definitely true that that arrivals have become more visibilized. So as you introduce border controls and make much more strict border controls, then you mean that it's illegal for a group of people to travel who could have traveled before. And so they take an irregular route. You will try and stop them from taking that irregular route and put up some new rules, some new barrier, some bigger fence. And so they have to take another route. And as you go along, those routes become more risky, more dangerous, and more visible. Yes. So that's the case in the Channel, and we can talk about that. And so, the Channel's a good example, actually, because we don't have more people crossing the Channel now than we did before, but we see them. They're there. And so then they're in small boats. They're not hidden in lorries. They're not clandestine. They're visible to the media. And so they're visible to you and I, even though we don't live on the Kent coast. Yeah. And so then that becomes something that is much more visible and a highly politicized issue. And so then it feels that it's a crisis. So we manufacture a crisis to be seen to solve a crisis, which, so I guess that's one part of the answer of what should the EU do? Because there's more refugees than ever before. There aren't, of course. And until Ukraine, it had been a really long time since Europe was actually facing a mass internal refugee crisis of the scale that it faced in the middle of the 20th century. Yeah. And then the Syrian crisis was the first test, I guess, of the massive test of that post-war regime. Yeah. And we can see how differently Syria was responded to Ukraine, for example. But what should they then do is not, I think, a small answer or a one part question. We talked about this a little bit before we started talking, before we started recording, but I think what you should do depends on what you want to achieve, and governments don't, all of the things that you might think you want to achieve aren't compatible with each other. And so you can't simply you can't stop people from coming. People will carry on coming. Yes. Irrespective of what you do. But you can't keep making a lot of effort to show you're going to stop them from coming, and which is constantly driving them to more dangerous and risky routes, and simultaneously say that you will centre human dignity and human rights. If you were centering human dignity and human rights, you wouldn't be making it so you can only risk drowning the Mediterranean in order to arrive, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, if you wanted a kind of middle road where you respected human rights and had a moderate control of your borders, then you would uphold the conventions to which you had signed, so a lot of problems are created by underfunding asylum administration systems. So then you have large numbers of people waiting in really squalid conditions and unable to get legal advice. You would just fund that system so that it was not in crisis, so that people could have their human rights recognised and make an application and have it assessed. So there's many different things that you could do, and it depends on what your priority
What the priorities are.
is.
So to try and build on that, from my understanding, is it's what should be at the center of policy. Is it actually, well, what we think it should be is following the Geneva Convention, which is providing human rights to everyone who is trying to seek refugee or asylum status. And then from there, trying to create policy or organizations to actually work towards those goals. But are you maybe saying that actually that's not at the center? That maybe at the center it's being skewed with political motivation, media influence, maybe even elections as well?
Yeah, so it's 100% driven by politics now, not by solving anyone's problems or realizing anyone's human rights.
Right, okay then. So then that's challenging at the end of the day, because that's what we would like it to be. And maybe yourself, who's researched this field for a long time, you think that's what policy should be. So I guess, why do you feel politicians maybe don't quite put that at the center of their policy making? Are they rightfully or wrongfully doing it? Because politicians, I feel at the end they're there to represent the people and what the people are interested in. So then the question is, are people actually not as interested in, maybe not saying following the Geneva Convention, but what was at the heart of it? I guess, why do you feel politicians are skewed in different directions? Is it financially they're skewed away from it?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because it's, why is it an issue that most of the public would care about? So most people will never meet anyone who has applied for asylum.
Yeah.
They do not live anywhere near a border zone. They have no access to this issue or knowing that it's particularly an issue, aside from hearing about it in the media. So I think sometimes we misunderstand. Politicians tell us all the time that they do what people, like, they're democratically elected, and so they just have to do what people want. But they also play a really strong role through the media and alongside the media in shaping people's concerns and worries and preferences. And so it's very difficult then to start to have a conversation about, is the administrative system well funded enough that the number of applications can just be assessed, or kind of look at any element of it rationally. So there's no way for all of these people to apply for asylum in the UK except by travelling across the channel in a small boat. Yeah. So what's the best way to stop them travelling in small boats? Provide some legal advice or means by which they could navigate this administrative system. It's nothing really to do with us living here in Sheffield.
Yes.
But and so I don't believe that the policies are responsive to public demand outside of that demand being produced by the discourse.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that in this period of neoliberal capitalism in crisis that we're in now, where the economic model has produced widening inequality, has produced a growing number of people in precarious jobs, in poverty, with precarity going up the income scale, with middle-class people even finding that they can't live the life they expected, or their children might not have the social mobility that they had in their lifetimes. With all of this slipping back, what does capitalism need to sustain itself as a model? It needs differentiation, and it needs to pit people against each other so that we don't challenge the system. And so I think identifying folk devils or people who are to blame, and we need to like pour our ire into them. And if we can just make them go away or get rid of them, then things are going to be better. I think that is a massive part of the political discourse, that kind of scapegoating and distraction. So that's what I meant earlier when I said, let's manufacture the crisis. So the policy and the bordering produces the irregular migration. From the point at which the Channel Tunnel opens and people are trying to walk through the tunnel, you do more and more bordering, you have infrared detectors and CO2 detectors and giant X-ray machines that lorries go through, and all kinds. You spend billions and billions on border controls so that people can't really stow away, and now they're driven into the boats. So you produce the crisis of the boats, and then you have to be seen to solve the crisis. But you've produced the thing where there's this, you're now telling people, this invading force, these invading people, they're nothing to do with us if we don't stop them. And it's like a really good narrative, I think, politically, to
seem to be attacking, create a crisis, or...
And none of those people, like, since most of us will never meet people across the channel, and most of the people across the channel aren't voters, you kind of can't, there's so much political value to be extracted from this, that I think it's, you were asking about kind of democracy and whether politicians should just respond to what people want. I think it's a more complex role that this issue plays in politics and in the politics of what we choose to identify as a problem. So we could maybe talk about the money that's being made for the border controls, and the last government under Rishi Sunak wanted to stop the boats. Now Keir Starmer wants to smash the gangs. And a lot of discussion is made about how smugglers are making so much money from this heinous business of stopping people moving. And so this is the crisis, right? This is the crisis. We're being invaded, and there's all these evil smuggling gangs, and they're making so much money. But we could talk about other things that are the crisis. So there's one crisis where in our team, we've been looking at the contracts for companies that are facilitating the border in the Channel. We found £5 billion of contracts since 2017 to 2024. And these are companies that are making, one drone company got £1 billion, a helicopter company got £2 billion. Like, these are massive amounts of money.
These are border force private companies. Is that what they are?
So let me finish the point, and then I'll tell you about the companies, because I've got my briefing in front of me. But I think so we could frame it as these people invading, and we have to stop them, and we have to stop these evil smuggling gangs. But we could also say, what is the crisis? The crisis is children, young boys, people living in tents in northern France, regularly having their tents and all their belongings destroyed by the police every 24 hours, and the no fixation policy, massive deforestation all around the northern France, Calais, Dunkirk area to stop people being able to camp, just absolutely like inhuman and degrading, like crimes against humanity occurring, essentially, massive human rights violations. And rather than doing anything to address this, we're giving billions of pounds to private companies that are making massive profits out of human suffering. And then when we look at some of those companies are, some of them are in fact involved in war zones, involved in selling arms and defense and military from displacement, which causes displacement in regions of origin. Then people find themselves flee, and then they find the same companies stopping their movement and like having drones flying above them. And instead of doing anything to help those people, we're just sucking money out of the system from a democratic demand to do more bordering, which will make it more dangerous. So it's like you can frame what is the crisis, what is the problem, and what needs to be done one way or another. But it's certain that this isn't just like a problem that could be solved. it's a situation which some people are extracting massive political value from, and some people are extracting massive economic value from.
Yes.
And yeah, I can tell you about the companies.
Yeah, that'd be good. I wanted to maybe get some examples of these companies that could explain the crisis, how you would define it. Yeah.
So this border security market is massive globally. So it was $377 billion US in 2023, and it's predicted to more than double by 2032. So not that long. It's like a massive and expanding market. So we found, we went through, it's really difficult actually democratically, from a democratic point of view, to actually find out information on these things. Okay. So rather than being able to find it easily through kind of government sources, we went through like contract finder and procurement websites where they'd advertise tenders for government.
What is this brief that you're creating?
Oh yeah, so we've created this big database of contracts because we ourselves, we began this work on the contracts because we were thinking, but none of these border controls and these words like stop the boats, smash the gangs, from everything we know from 20 years of our own research about borders, we know that that won't stop people from moving. It won't work. And then we started to think, so why would they do it if it won't work? And it'll just sow the seeds of a future crisis and like more death and harm. Mm-hmm. And then we started to think, but does it work? Maybe. Like, who does it not work for? And who does it work for? Okay. So whose interests would be served actually by having this agenda with this never-ending pool, of money that can be spent on it. And so we knew, because we'd done a lot of analysis of the political discourse, we knew that politicians were attempting to extract political value from it and to fight the last election around it. Mm-hmm. But when we started to look into who's profiteering from it, we realized that the scale of the money to be made from this, and actually this is only a very partial view because we were focusing only on the Channel border zone. So it's much more vast if we expanded far into the country with all of the detention centres and the kind of border apparatus. So there were lots of things that we didn't include because we couldn't isolate it to the Channel. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting range of things. So the average contract is 27 million, but there's ones from almost 2 billion to like only £4,000. So the biggest ones are like 2 billion to the Bristow Group for helicopters, a billion to Takeva, which is a Portuguese drone company. Serco, who you might know. So there are these companies that sell public services to governments, and they do that all over the world, and they make loads of money from it. So 514 million. Sorry, I'm looking at the MITI one. The Serco one for Tinsley House Centre and Brook House Removal Centre. So there are some detention centres which were refurbished and done up and reopened as well for Rwanda, to hold people for Rwanda. So MITI Care and Custody, so they do escorting services in northern France and holding people. So 514 million for them. 130 million for maritime patrol aircrafts, a company called Landau. So all of, like, at Galliford Try got 100 million for doing up those two, 170 million for doing up those two detention centres, which were going to be used for Rwanda. So all sorts of things. There's 96 million for a company called Leidos, who do biometrics and fingerprinting. So some of these are like big global companies like Serco and Capita and BAE Systems, Deloitte, Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli defense company, Fujitsu, G4S, MITI, these kinds of ones. But there's also some really, like, this isn't just big companies feeding off the border. It's like an economy all in itself. Yes. So that economy has little local companies as well. So the King's Ferry Coach Company received like 2.5, nearly 3 million for coach services for Border Force, for example. There's companies that sell craft and crew to bring people in on small boats. There's a company called Wagtail UK that got 23.5 million for providing sniffer dogs that can sniff humans.
Okay.
There's like fees for legal support, 7.7 million for marquees and temporary accommodation in a day when a lot of people arrived. British event catering that do like catering for parties and things, 700,000 for emergency catering. So there's like all kinds of things.
Yes.
Yes. You know, like Enterprise Rent-A-Car got 13,000 for renting, vehicles, inflatable raft maintenance, a lot of like boat maintenance, boat servicing, dockyards, boatyards on the south coast. So from the kind of local right up to the global companies, there's a whole economy around this, which is really interesting, I think. And it's really hard to
imagine that.
find out about. Right. And no one speaks about it at all. Whereas we're constantly told about this kind of evil invading force of kind of.
But we're talking about break down the gangs, but the gangs we think of as those people that are helping people cross the channel, providing the boats, which maybe you want to smash those per se, but you're talking about a local known but unknown market that's happening here. But you know, some of those services, if I just had to play the other side, is it not quite normal for government to use private companies to deliver services that are actually of needed? So border control is somewhat needed at the end of the day. And instead for just doing it by the government, they've just asked some private companies to do it. That would be an argument that someone would say. But then are you more actually saying actually it's a far bigger model that's actually happening?
Well, I suppose it depends. That's an ideological position, isn't it? Yeah. Because if you think it's normal for private companies to deliver not so much services, but things that states do, like control their borders, that's like a particular neoliberal view of how governments should interact with the private sector. Or whether they should do it themselves. So I think when we're doing this and tracking these contracts, we're not really looking to say this is great or this is awful. We're looking to say, isn't it interesting that all of this money is being spent on border control? We know that people will continue to cross, and that because of these efforts, people will continue to cross, taking more dangerous journeys, and so more people will be harmed and die. And isn't it interesting that we never spend any time talking about it at all in the public space, and that it's so difficult to get any public accountability or conversations like in the public sphere about it, compared to like smugglers who are often represented as gangs, whether they're in gangs or not.
So then, I guess, why do you think this has not been talked about in the public space? Why not by the media or effectively by campaign groups?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? When you compare it to other things. So recently...
It's quite striking, those statistics, those things that you just told me, and even opened my eyes on it.
And the governments tend not to be shy about saying how much money they're spending on things in order to say that's a bad thing. So recently there's been a lot of discussion about the disability payments, disability welfare payments, which we know over the period of austerity have just become extremely difficult to kind of meet the bar to qualify for those kinds of payments. And it's been in the media for like a decade or so, I think, how constrained that's been. And there's been so much discussion recently about how expensive these disability payments are and what needs to be done to these people to make them work, and how they're somehow cheating the system and should just get on with being resilient or whatever they're meant to do. And that's the same amount of money. It's the exact same amount, 5 billion, that's a problem for the government to spend. But they don't want to spend. So there are many topics where they want to say we spend all this money and it's a problem. But on this, well, they'll spend all this money, but it won't stop people. It won't stop small boat channel crossings.
Yes.
We don't ever want to spend 1 second talking about how much it's costing.
No, we don't.
So I don't know. I guess as an academic, I'm just interested in those kinds of discursive differences and what there's a lot of noise about and what there's a lot of silence about. I'm interested in how much noise there is about smugglers who we have a massive body of evidence. So we know why smuggling exists globally, and we know that it just feeds off the borders. And so you can't stop smuggling with more bordering. You'll just have more smuggling if you had more bordering. So you'll never smash the gangs. They're not just like 3 gangs and you can catch them in a net. They're like just a pool of highly dispersed people. You replace their very responsive and opportunistic. Like people will always pop up. Like you're on a forever mission to smash the gangs, basically. And you know that the border controls have produced the gangs. So in spending billions more on the borders, you know the smuggling is the flip side of it. You know that you're producing demand for smuggling all the time, off into the future. So it's interesting never to speak of it now, how much you're spending on that, or if that's a good thing to spend money on. So I think the conversations that we have in the public sphere on issues like this are so constrained and so limited that it has to be like a yes, no, good, bad, we should do this or we should do that kind of thing, rather than like this is really complex problem with a set of interacting things, and we could stop the boats tomorrow, but that would mean we would have more people applying for asylum. That's a trade-off. And so then you could have a conversation about that, but there's no conversation. So yeah, I think it's interesting.
From it's a Cranston Inquiry, that came from an unfortunate incident in November 2021 where they suspected 27 people had died. I think it was one of the largest deaths from the French Channel crossings. And I read your group's recommendations to that inquiry, and one of the things it was to actually move the border in terms of where refugees would seek asylum actually to the UK border, rather than I think necessarily dealing with it in the Channel, in the French border. Like for you must see that as sensible policy, but I guess building on from what we just discussed, why do you think then that would not be taken forward, or will take time for that to be taken forward?
No, I don't think it'll be taken forward.
Yeah.
But I think it's important because we are not like a campaign group. We occupy a different position in this conversation. As academics, we can say, what do we know from the evidence? And we can put ideas into the public conversation. And so I think there's things that we could say about why did that disaster occur, and why are the deaths increasing, and why are is there more like wounding and unharm in the embarkations in France? But maybe we can talk about that in a minute. The thing with the Cranston Inquiry was, if the question is how can we stop people getting in these small boats where, even though it's actually a really different situation to the Mediterranean and the chance of drowning not close to the shore where it's increasing, but when you've got on is actually it's not that dangerous a route compared to the Mediterranean, but still the danger will always exist. So how can we stop people getting in small boats? If that is the question, then the obvious answer is, well, let them get on a ferry. Like there's It's £50 to get on a ferry. It's £3,500 to get in a small boat, and you might die. So the answer to that, if the centre of, going back to what I was saying before, if the thing we want to do is to stop 6-year-old children being suffocated in the middle of an overcrowded dinghy on the shore of Calais, then if this is like an intolerable, can you imagine if that happened to a British child? Like, we'd move heaven and earth. So if that's what we would want to do, if we see those people as equal human beings, just as worthy of living as we are, and we don't want to purposefully endanger them, then that we currently have our borders outside of the UK, like in France, why not let people, like the solution to that is let people get on a ferry and apply for asylum on the other side. And we didn't say that to be naive. We understand that that is not, in the current terms of the conversation, that isn't politically possible.
Yes.
It's intolerable, completely unthinkable to allow people to apply for asylum when they arrive, and we can think about why that would be, and the kind of general framing of those people. But we proposed that because that's how you would stop people crossing in small boats.
Yes.
And that's how you would kill dead the smuggling business.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to stop the smuggling business and stop people getting in small boats, that's what you can do. The question of that being politically impossible in this moment is like the obvious answer, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't. That's not the thing.
That's true. I guess someone who would be listening may give an argument that, is it actually feasible to do that? To have regular, safe travels across the border for these refugees, asylum seekers, then they come here in the UK where they are assessed. But then don't we have issues in the UK where we have many refugees, asylum seekers in these detention centres waiting years to be processed? Are we not going to increase the numbers of that? Are we going to increase the waiting time? So I can see the argument. Politically feasible, probably not. But then is it actually financially feasible?
Well, financially it's feasible because we're spending so much. We're like giving so much money to the French. We're spending so much money on this that, of course, so the problems with the hotels and the backlogs are manufactured by the system. So if you have enough people assessing, if you just fund the administrative system, then you, like the Rwanda legislation set 3 groups of people in different levels of legal limbo where their assessments they weren't having their asylum applications assessed because they were being assessed to go to Rwanda, and there had to be a special case that they weren't going. So we had this like massive backlog building for several years, and they couldn't be housed, and so there was like emergency barracks and barges and hotels opened. So whether we could afford to assess the applications, then like, yes, we could afford to assess the applications. But I think the question is more about the politics of immigration. So the question is not, can we afford it? It's not, are they an economic burden? The question is, can we welcome them? And the answer to that is probably no. Because we're not capable of that, because I think that there is widespread hostility.
So building on that, we have seen the rise in the last few years or decade of far-right parties. In the UK, we've got Reform UK gaining popularity. There's far-right parties now building in Germany, France, Italy. I guess, and some would say that now some of that is maybe more mainstream, or the views of those people. There's a reason why they're voting for these. It's a significant population of people. Could you maybe steelman the case, or could you talk about why do you think there is more people voting for these parties? Is it actually some of their concerns are legitimate, or are they construed in some way? Is it a failure of mainstream governments? Why do you think we're seeing a rise of this and people being concerned with migration?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too far outside my expertise because I'm not a political scientist that looks about electoral behaviour and things. Yeah. So, but I'll kind of
touch on it if we can.
Do my best to think that through. I think that so there isn't right. Okay, let me think of the order in which I think things. So, like in everything, the narrative is that what is happening is brand new. So a hostile politics of immigration is not new in the UK, right? We know that. So we can look back many decades to like how has British citizenship and immigration policy evolved. So when do you get the first people being smuggled across the Channel? You get it in 1968, in the late 60s, because people from India, Pakistan, other places who had just been entering with appropriate passports suddenly had a border saying you can't. And so you get people smuggling themselves across and using the same kinds of routes that people use today. And that's when the Cross-Channel Intelligence Committee formed with police from France and the UK to stop smuggling. That's when they first started. So there have always been strong anti-immigration currents, and that's always been mainstream in British politics, I think. And it's always tricky for me to think about because a lot of my work has looked across history. Yes. And so from my point of view, immigration politics across the whatever party's in power, it's always been on the far right. Like the conversation is always on the far right. It's always like towards the most racist, dehumanizing policy approach. But I think that these particular parties have been successful in recent years because of a number of things. So there is certainly a very well-organized transnational movement of far-right organizers who are relatively well-funded, and there's really good research about this, about the transnational far-right and how they're successfully mobilizing on so people now don't get their political education from trade unions, that we should all form a international working class revolution or whatever. They get their political education from like YouTube and TikTok and things, that that those platforms are run by the right, and that they are the far right have been really, really successful in using those technologies to spread their kind of political opinions. I think that's definitely a strong phenomenon that's happened. There have then been different things that have happened in different countries. Like in the UK, the Brexit vote certainly unleashed a strong anti-immigration discussion. Yeah. And even though Brexit had little effect on asylum as an issue, the Syrian refugee crisis in mainland Europe, which we were really marginal to, but became, because of the Farage in front of that big sign kind of thing. So I think that helped to mainstream a set of conversations by Nigel Farage and colleagues, which pulled far-right ideas and further into the mainstream. I think as academics, for a really long time, up to around that period, we anticipated a crisis of capitalism where there would necessitate a backlash against the sucking of money up to elites, increasing inequality and, precarity and all of these things, and fewer jobs, international divisions of labour where manufacturing jobs have gone elsewhere so that big companies can make more money by having outsourced labour and everything. We expect a backlash from that. We didn't, but until in the period after the financial crisis and leading up to Brexit, I think around Brexit, we didn't expect the backlash to come from the far right. Okay. And this is currently, since in many countries, the left is in decline and the centre left is always on the right on immigration. Yes. So the backlash against the unfairnesses and the destruction of our lives through capitalism, the far right are the only actors with a political voice speaking loudly in an organised way across all of these platforms about what's happening to your life. There's no jobs. There's like, how is society falling apart? And why is your child's school falling apart? And why is there no doctors in the hospital? And blah, 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 blah. And for them, migration is like a core part of the answer, a core part of the problem. And so I think that they are then able to present immigration as an important part in the puzzle in understanding what's happened to your life. Why won't your children own a home when you were able to buy a home, when your parents bought their council house, when you've been on the up and now you don't know what the future looks like?
Yes.
I think they're the only people occupying the space of having answers. So when we look at the centre and the centre left, there's a kind of thing that's been happening across Europe where, as these far-right voices occupy the space almost of anti-capitalism, but with strong racism and anti-immigration politics, the left goes to meet them. The centre-left and the centre-right goes to meet them. So we see this with the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in the UK, but it's happened in countries across Europe.
Yes.
And when they go to meet them, voters are on the centre and left are alienated by that. And voters who might be sympathetic to those far-right parties don't believe them. They don't believe them that they'll do all these horrible things that they say they will. So they don't get the votes. And so what you find is the far-right cannibalizing the whole of the right. So that's what's happened to the Conservative Party now.
Yes.
And it's happened in other countries. It's happening in Germany and in the Netherlands. So you have a situation where you have the centre and you have the far right as the dominant conversations in politics.
Yes.
And then, as I said earlier, on immigration, everything is on the right and further, and not on the liberal human rights right, but on the keep them out. They're probably going to steal all our jobs and bring lots of diseases kind of right. So I think that's what's been happening. But I'm not an electoral researcher.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. So you would say the far right have maybe captured the argument of these are the concerns, and they very effectively use media, websites, social media, YouTube to almost feel like they are the solution for it as well. Yes, but you think the migration, when they blame migration because of all these things, you don't think migration or immigration has actually worsened over the years, but just rather they've just capitalized it.
What do you mean by worsened?
No, worse in terms of, let's say, they would say the number of illegal and regular migration has increased in the UK and Europe. And all these issues that we just talked about, lack of public services and housing and jobs and stuff, they would then use migration as that's the reason, immigration. They would use immigration as the reason why that's the cause. Do you think they've just effectively combined that argument together? Not necessarily if it's true or not, but you just think that's what you feel is happening.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots of elements of that where I would say, well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So is immigration increasing? Are immigrants stealing jobs? Are blah,